For decades, they thought it was a simple family photo, until they noticed the girl's gaze. Dr. Elizabeth Carter had spent 20 years as a photographic conservator at the Smithsonian Institution, but the discovery she made on a rainy Saturday morning in November 2024 would prove to be one of the most haunting and historically significant of her career. She wasn't even supposed to be working that day, but a colleague had asked her to examine a collection of Victorian-era photographs being offered at an estate sale in Salem, Massachusetts, and Elizabeth's curiosity had gotten the better of her weekend plans. The estate belonged to the recently deceased Margaret Thornton, a 97-year-old woman whose family had lived in Salem since the early 1800s. The house was a beautiful but declining Victorian mansion filled with generations of accumulated possessions: furniture, books, paintings, and dozens of boxes containing family photographs and documents. Elizabeth arrived early before the public sale began, to assess whether any items were historically significant enough for museum acquisition. In the library, surrounded by leather-bound books and the musty smell of old paper, Elizabeth found 3 cardboard boxes labeled Family Photographs, 1850s, 1900s. She carefully opened the first box and began examining the contents. Most were typical Victorian family portraits: stern-faced men in dark suits, women in elaborate dresses with tight corseted waists, children posed stiffly in their Sunday best. The photography quality varied from professional studio portraits to amateur snapshots, each image offering a glimpse into 19th century American life. Then, near the bottom of the second box, Elizabeth found it. The photograph was larger than most of the others, measuring approximately 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing, typical of professional studio work from the 1880s. The image showed a family of 5 people arranged in a formal parlor setting. A bearded father, standing on the left, a mother seated on the right, 2 boys of perhaps 8 and 10 years old standing behind an ornate chair, and in the center, seated in that chair, a girl of about 6 years old wearing an immaculate white dress with delicate lace trim. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard, if somewhat somber, Victorian family portrait. The family members all wore dark, formal clothing except for the girl in white, and their expressions carried the serious, unsmiling demeanor typical of the era when photographs required long exposure times. But something about the image made Elizabeth pause and look more carefully. There was an unusual quality to the composition, something she couldn't quite identify, but that triggered her professional instincts, developed over 2 decades of examining historical photographs. She turned the photograph over and found an inscription on the backing, written in faded brown ink in an elegant Victorian script. The family, September 1883. Nothing more. No names, no location beyond Salem, no indication of the photographer's studio. But there was something else. A small notation in pencil, added in different handwriting, perhaps years later. "Never forget our angel." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. That phrase, "our angel," combined with the unusual feeling she had gotten from the image, suggested this might not be the simple family portrait it appeared to be. Elizabeth carefully placed the photograph in a protective archival sleeve and set it aside from the other items. She continued examining the contents of the boxes, finding several other photographs of what appeared to be the same family at different times, but none with the same formal, staged quality as the one that had caught her attention. She also found letters, receipts, and family documents that helped her piece together the family's identity. They were the Harrisons, a prosperous merchant family who had lived in Salem from the 1840s until the early 1900s. After completing her assessment of the entire collection and negotiating with the estate executor to acquire several historically significant items for the Smithsonian, Elizabeth returned to her hotel room with digital scans of the Harrison family photographs, including high-resolution images of the mysterious 1883 portrait. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about that particular photograph, something hidden in plain sight that decades or perhaps a century of viewers had missed. That evening, Elizabeth opened the digital file on her laptop and began examining the image with the careful attention she had trained herself to apply to historical photographs. She adjusted the brightness and contrast, zoomed in on different sections, and studied each family member's face and posture. The father, probably in his late 30s, stood with one hand resting on the back of the ornate chair where the girl sat. His expression was grave, his eyes dark with what looked like profound sadness. The mother, seated in a separate chair to the right, held a handkerchief in one hand, her face turned slightly away from the camera as if she couldn't bear to look directly at the lens. The 2 boys standing behind the chair both had their hands placed on the chair's back, almost protectively, and their young faces showed a solemnity beyond their years. But it was the girl in the center who drew Elizabeth's attention most powerfully. She sat perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap over the white dress that seemed almost luminous in the photograph. Her hair was arranged in careful ringlets, and she wore a small locket around her neck. Everything about her positioning and presentation suggested she was the focal point of the photograph, the reason this formal, expensive portrait had been commissioned. Elizabeth zoomed in on the girl's face, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The girl's eyes were open, but there was something profoundly wrong about them. They didn't focus on the camera, didn't focus on anything at all. The gaze was fixed and distant, looking not at the photographer or at any point in the room, but seemingly through everything, into some vast emptiness. The pupils appeared dilated and oddly reflective, catching the light in a way that human eyes in life don't quite capture. The more Elizabeth studied those eyes, the more certain she became that something was terribly, tragically wrong with this image. She zoomed out and examined the girl's overall posture. Victorian children in photographs typically showed some signs of fidgeting or slight movement blur because holding perfectly still for the required exposure time was difficult for young children. But this girl was absolutely, impossibly still. Not a single detail showed motion blur. Her hands in her lap were positioned with unnatural precision, and her head was held at an angle that seemed slightly wrong, as if someone had carefully arranged it rather than the child holding it naturally. Elizabeth knew what she was looking at. She had seen similar photographs before in her conservation work, though never one quite so beautifully and elaborately staged. This was a memento mori photograph, a post-mortem portrait of a deceased child. The practice had been common, even standard in the Victorian era, particularly in the 1870s and 1880s, when childhood mortality rates were devastatingly high, and photography was still rare and expensive enough that many families had only 1 or 2 photographs of their children. Unable to sleep that night, Elizabeth spent hours researching Victorian post-mortem photography practices and the specific techniques photographers used to make deceased subjects appear lifelike. What she learned was both fascinating from a historical perspective and deeply moving from a human one. In the 19th century, before modern medicine dramatically reduced childhood mortality, families faced an approximately 20% chance that their child would die before reaching the age of 5. Diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, and pneumonia claimed thousands of children every year. For grieving Victorian parents, a photograph of their deceased child was often the only visual remembrance they would have. Professional photographers developed specialized techniques for post-mortem portraits, especially for children. They would position the body carefully, sometimes using hidden stands or supports to keep the subject upright and in a natural-seeming pose. They would arrange the clothing meticulously, often dressing the child in their best outfit or a special white burial gown. Some photographers would even paint over the eyelids to create the appearance of open eyes, or in some cases, would carefully prop the actual eyelids open and touch up the photograph afterward to make the eyes appear more lifelike. The goal was to create an image that captured the child as the family wanted to remember them. Peaceful, beautiful, and, in the case of some portraits, seemingly alive. Some families chose to pose the deceased child alone, perhaps holding a favorite toy or flower. Others, like the Harrison family, chose to create a final family portrait that showed the entire family together one last time, with the deceased child as the honored center of the composition. Elizabeth found academic articles and museum collections documenting hundreds of such photographs. She read accounts from Victorian diaries and letters describing the heartbreaking process of arranging these final photographic sessions, usually within a day or two of death before burial. Parents would dress their child with trembling hands, photographers would work with reverent efficiency, and families would gather in the painful, surreal space between death and burial to create this lasting memorial. The practice was not considered morbid or disturbing by Victorian standards. Instead, it was seen as a loving act of remembrance, a way to honor the deceased and create a tangible connection to a lost loved one. In an era when most people died at home surrounded by family rather than in hospitals, death was a more visible and accepted part of everyday life than it would later become in the 20th century. Elizabeth understood all of this intellectually and professionally. She had studied Victorian mourning customs extensively, but understanding the historical context didn't make the photograph any less heartbreaking or the little girl's empty gaze any less haunting. The next morning, Elizabeth contacted the estate executor and explained that she needed to examine the Harrison family documents more thoroughly for historical research purposes. The executor, a local attorney named James Morrison who seemed relieved to have expert assistance in sorting through the massive estate, readily agreed and arranged for Elizabeth to spend the following day at the Thornton mansion going through the family papers. Elizabeth arrived at the house early on Monday morning, carrying her laptop, camera, and archival supplies. James had set up a work area for her in the library where she had first discovered the photographs. He brought her several additional boxes of documents that had belonged to Margaret Thornton, whose mother had been born into the Harrison family, making Margaret the great-great-granddaughter of the family in the photograph. Elizabeth spent the morning carefully sorting through letters, receipts, birth certificates, death certificates, property deeds, and other documents spanning more than a century of Harrison family history. Around noon, she found what she was looking for: a family Bible, its leather cover worn and cracked with age, containing handwritten records of births, marriages, and deaths dating back to 1840. She opened the Bible carefully, her hands steady despite her growing anticipation. The birth records showed that the Harrison family, headed by Robert Harrison and his wife Catherine, had 5 children: William born in 1873, Charles born in 1875, Sarah born in 1877, and then 2 more children born in 1885 and 1887 after the photograph was taken. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Sarah would have been 6 years old in 1883, matching the age of the girl in the white dress. She turned to the death records with a sense of inevitable dread. And there it was, written in careful, grief-stricken script. Sarah Elizabeth Harrison, born April 3, 1877, died September 12, 1883. Age, 6 years, 5 months. Taken from us by scarlet fever. Our beloved angel has gone to heaven. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, the Bible open before her, and felt tears prick her eyes. September 1883. The photograph was dated September 1883. The timing meant that the photograph had been taken within days of Sarah's death, perhaps even on the day of her funeral. The beautiful white dress was likely her burial gown. The locket around her neck probably contained a lock of hair or a miniature portrait of her parents, and the family gathered around her, her grieving father, her devastated mother, her protective older brothers, had assembled one final time to create a lasting memorial of their complete family before Sarah was laid to rest. Elizabeth continued searching through the documents and found a letter written by Catherine Harrison to her sister in Boston, dated October 15, 1883, just a month after Sarah's death. The letter was written in a shaking hand and stained with what might have been tears. Elizabeth read it with a heavy heart, feeling like an intruder on private grief, but knowing this document was crucial to understanding the photograph's context and significance. Catherine Harrison's letter to her sister provided a window into the devastating loss the family had experienced and the circumstances that led to the creation of the photograph. Elizabeth transcribed the letter carefully, preserving the original spelling and punctuation, conscious that she was documenting an invaluable historical and human record. "My dearest sister Elizabeth," the letter began, "I write to you from a darkness I never imagined possible. Our sweet Sarah, our precious angel, was taken from us on the 12th of September. The scarlet fever came so suddenly, so viciously. She was playing in the garden on Monday morning, laughing and picking flowers. By Tuesday afternoon, she was burning with fever. By Wednesday evening, she complained her throat hurt terribly. By Friday, we could barely recognize her for the rash and the suffering. And by Wednesday of the following week, she was gone. 6 days from the first symptom to death. 6 days to lose the light of our lives." The letter continued, describing the funeral arrangements and then explaining the photograph. "Robert insisted we have Mr. Whitmore make a photograph of our family complete one final time before we laid Sarah to rest. I confessed I could not bear the thought, could not imagine sitting for a portrait with my dead child dressed and positioned as if she still lived. It seemed unnatural, even grotesque in my grief-maddened state. But Robert was insistent, and his mother supported him, saying we would regret not having this remembrance. She said that in years to come, we would treasure having Sarah in a family photograph, that it would help us remember her face when memory begins to fade." Catherine described the painful process of preparing for the photograph. "We dressed Sarah in the white gown I had made for her to wear at her cousin's wedding next spring. She never got to wear it in life, so she wears it now in death. I placed her grandmother's locket around her neck and arranged her beautiful golden curls, as I had done every morning of her life. Mr. Whitmore came to our home, rather than having us bring Sarah to his studio, a kindness we greatly appreciated. He was respectful and gentle, treating Sarah with as much care as if she still breathed." The letter revealed details about how the photograph was taken. "Mr. Whitmore positioned Sarah in my mother's chair, the one with the carved back that Sarah always loved. He used a device behind the chair to help support her, keeping her upright and positioned naturally. He arranged her hands in her lap just as she often sat when listening to stories. Then he asked us to gather around her. Robert stood behind her with his hand on the chair, protective even in death. Our boys William and Charles placed their hands on the chair as well, and I sat to the side, unable to look directly at the camera or at Sarah without dissolving completely." Catherine described the photographer's technique. "Mr. Whitmore took great pains with Sarah's eyes. He opened them gently and used some substance to keep them from closing. Then, afterward, he said he would touch up the photograph to make them look more natural. He promised us it would appear as if she were simply sitting quietly, perhaps a bit sleepy, not as if she had passed from this world. I am not certain whether I find this comforting or disturbing, but I trust it was done with loving intent." Intrigued by the mention of Mr. Whitmore, the photographer who had created the Harrison family portrait, Elizabeth began researching Victorian photographers in Salem during the 1880s. She found references to Edmund Whitmore, who had operated a photography studio on Essex Street from 1875 to 1895, and who had developed a reputation for his sensitive handling of memorial photography. Elizabeth discovered that Whitmore had advertised his services specifically for memorial and mourning portraits in local newspapers, and that he had written several letters to photography journals of the era describing his techniques and philosophy. Through the Salem Historical Society, Elizabeth was able to access digitized copies of these letters, which provided remarkable insight into how Victorian photographers approached the delicate task of post-mortem portraiture. In a letter published in the Photographic Times in 1884, just a year after the Harrison portrait, Whitmore had written, "The photographer who undertakes memorial portraiture must approach the work with the utmost reverence and sensitivity. We are not merely creating an image. We are providing grieving families with their final and often only photograph of a beloved family member. This is particularly true when photographing deceased children, where the parent's anguish is beyond description. Whitmore described his technical approach. For a seated pose, I employ a specially designed support system that attaches discreetly behind the chair, providing invisible assistance in maintaining an upright and natural posture. The deceased's clothing should be arranged with meticulous care, and the hands positioned gently in poses that reflect the individual's character in life. For children, I often suggest holding a favorite toy or flower, or simply folding the hands in peaceful repose. The most revealing passage addressed the question of the eyes. The matter of the eyes is perhaps the most sensitive aspect of memorial photography. Some photographers prefer to photograph the deceased with eyes closed, suggesting peaceful sleep. Others, at the family's request, will carefully open the eyes and use various methods to keep them in that position during the exposure. I have found that families often prefer the appearance of open eyes, as it creates the impression of the loved one still present and engaged with the family. However, it requires considerable skill in the subsequent development and touching up to make the eyes appear natural rather than merely open. I use fine brushwork to add light and depth to the eyes in the final print, creating an appearance of life where life has departed. Whitmore also addressed the emotional dimension of his work. I confess that photographing deceased children affects me deeply, no matter how many times I perform this service. To see parents holding their composure through sheer force of will, to arrange the small body of a child who should be running and playing, to capture in silver and paper the last visible evidence of a young life extinguished too soon. This work requires not just technical skill, but emotional fortitude, yet I consider it perhaps the most important service I provide. These photographs become treasured family heirlooms, handled with reverent care and passed down through generations. They serve as proof that the deceased lived, was loved, and is remembered. Elizabeth sat back from her laptop, deeply moved by Whitmore's words. He had clearly understood the profound importance of what he was doing, not creating a macabre spectacle, but providing a genuine service to grieving families in an era when such photographs were often the only visual record of a loved one's existence. As Elizabeth continued her research into the Harrison family, a more complete picture emerged of who they were and how Sarah's death had affected them. Through census records, city directories, property deeds, and newspaper archives, she traced the family's history before and after that terrible September in 1883. Robert Harrison had been a successful merchant in Salem, operating a dry goods store on Washington Street. The family lived in a comfortable 3-story home in a prosperous neighborhood, and by all accounts, they were respected members of the community, active in their church and various civic organizations. Catherine came from a similarly respectable family and was known for her charitable work with the Salem Female Charitable Society, which provided assistance to widows and orphans. The family's 2 sons, William and Charles, had both survived to adulthood, itself a fortunate outcome in an era when childhood mortality claimed so many. William had gone on to become a lawyer, and Charles had followed his father into the merchant business. Both had married and had children of their own, and Elizabeth found evidence that both men had remained in Salem throughout their lives. But Sarah's death had clearly affected the family profoundly. Elizabeth found a newspaper article from 1884, a year after Sarah's death, reporting on a generous donation the Harrisons had made to the Salem Hospital, specifically to support research into childhood diseases and to establish a ward for children suffering from contagious illnesses. The article quoted Robert Harrison as saying, "If our loss can prevent other families from suffering as we have suffered, then perhaps some meaning can be found in our tragedy." Catherine had become even more involved in charitable work after Sarah's death, particularly with organizations supporting children. Elizabeth found records showing that Catherine had helped establish a free school for poor children in Salem and had been a founding member of the Salem Children's Aid Society. It seemed Catherine had channeled her grief into helping other children, perhaps finding some comfort in protecting and nurturing children who still lived when her own daughter could not be saved. Elizabeth discovered something else significant in the family papers. A diary, kept by William Harrison, Sarah's older brother, started when he was 15 in 1888, 5 years after Sarah's death. Several entries referenced his lost sister and the photograph that had been taken after her death. In an entry dated September 12, 1888, the 5th anniversary of Sarah's death, William wrote, 5 years today since we lost Sarah. Mother brought out the photograph this morning, as she does every year on this date. I can barely look at it. I know why Father insisted on having it made. And I understand that it brings Mother some comfort to see us all together one last time. But I remember that day too clearly, the awful stillness of Sarah's body, the terrible pretense of arranging her as if she were merely sitting quietly. I remember the photographer's gentle voice as he positioned her, and I remember Mother's silent tears throughout the entire process. The photograph captures our family, yes, but it also captures our grief frozen forever in silver and paper. Elizabeth knew that to properly understand and present the Harrison family photograph, she needed to place it within the broader context of Victorian mourning customs and postmortem photography practices. She spent several days researching academic studies on the subject and consulting with colleagues who specialized in 19th century cultural history. What she learned reinforced that the Harrison family's decision to commission a memorial photograph of Sarah was not unusual or morbid by the standards of their time, but rather a common and accepted practice rooted in the realities of Victorian life and death. In the 1880s, childhood mortality in the United States remained tragically high, despite advances in medicine and public health. Scarlet fever, which had killed Sarah, was one of the leading causes of childhood death, along with diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, and pneumonia. Families of all social classes faced the very real possibility of losing one or more children. The emotional impact was devastating, but Victorians had developed elaborate mourning rituals and customs to help families navigate their grief. These customs included specific mourning clothing worn for prescribed periods, memorial jewelry made from the deceased's hair, death masks, and memorial photographs. Photography itself was still relatively new in the 1880s. The daguerreotype process had only been introduced in 1839, just 40-some years earlier. While photography had become more common and affordable by the 1880s, it was still expensive enough that many families, especially those of modest means, might commission only a handful of photographs in their entire lives. For families with young children, this often meant that a post-mortem photograph might be the only photograph they would ever have of a deceased child. Elizabeth found statistics that were both illuminating and heartbreaking. Historical studies estimated that between 30 and 40% of all photographs taken in the Victorian era were post-mortem portraits. The practice was so common that many photography studios kept special props, furniture, and backdrops specifically for memorial portraits. Some photographers, like Edmund Whitmore, even specialized in this type of work. The practices varied depending on regional customs, family preferences, and the age of the deceased. Infants were often photographed being held by their mother or lying in a cradle, sometimes with flowers arranged around them. Older children might be photographed alone, seated in a chair or lying on a bed or sofa, often dressed in white or in their best clothing. Some photographs showed the deceased with eyes closed in peaceful repose, while others, like Sarah's portrait, showed them with eyes open, creating an eerie semblance of life. Family portraits, including the deceased member, like the Harrison photograph, represented a particular subset of memorial photography. These portraits were often commissioned when a family wanted to create one final image, showing the family unit complete before burial separated them forever. Such photographs required considerable emotional fortitude from the living family members, who had to maintain their composure while posing alongside the body of their deceased loved one. Elizabeth also learned about the technical challenges photographers faced in creating these images. Bodies had to be photographed relatively quickly after death, before decomposition made the process impractical. Rigor mortis had to be worked through to position the body naturally. Photographers used various props and supports to maintain natural-looking poses, and they employed considerable skill in lighting, composition, and post-processing to create images that appeared peaceful rather than obviously depicting death. After weeks of research, Elizabeth had compiled a comprehensive understanding of the Harrison family photograph, its historical context, the family's story, the photographer's techniques, and the cultural practices that made such images both common and meaningful in Victorian America. She knew this photograph, with its detailed documentation and compelling human story, would be valuable for education and historical understanding. Elizabeth prepared a detailed proposal for a small exhibition at the Smithsonian focused on Victorian mourning photography and childhood mortality, with the Harrison family portrait as the centerpiece. She presented her proposal to the museum's curatorial board in January 2025, including the photograph itself, her research findings, and an explanation of why this particular image was historically and educationally significant. The board's response was mixed and reflected the sensitivity surrounding postmortem photography, especially of children. Some members were enthusiastic about the educational value of the exhibition, arguing that understanding Victorian attitudes toward death and mourning was important for comprehending 19th century American life. Others expressed concern about displaying what some visitors might find disturbing or disrespectful, particularly an image of a deceased child. After considerable discussion and debate, the board approved the exhibition with specific guidelines. The photograph would be displayed with extensive contextual information explaining Victorian mourning customs, childhood mortality rates, and the cultural significance of memorial photography. Warning signs would inform visitors about the sensitive nature of the content. The exhibition would emphasize the historical and cultural education aspects, while treating the Harrison family and little Sarah with appropriate dignity and respect. The exhibition, titled Remembered in Light, Victorian Memorial Photography and Childhood Loss, opened at the Smithsonian in April 2025. Elizabeth had designed it to guide visitors through a careful educational journey, starting with information about Victorian childhood mortality and public health, then explaining mourning customs and rituals, and finally presenting several examples of memorial photographs, including the Harrison family portrait. The Harrison photograph was displayed in a dedicated alcove with subdued lighting. The wall text told Sarah's story based on Elizabeth's research: her birth in 1877, her death from scarlet fever in 1883 at age 6, her family's grief, and the creation of this memorial photograph as a lasting remembrance. The text included excerpts from Katherine Harrison's letter and William's diary entry, providing the family's own voices and perspectives. A timeline showed the progression of the photograph from its creation in 1883 through its preservation in family collections to its rediscovery in 2024. Elizabeth had also prepared an accompanying educational pamphlet explaining Victorian post-mortem photography practices in detail, including technical information about how such photographs were created, statistics on childhood mortality in the 19th century, and scholarly articles on Victorian mourning culture. The goal was to help visitors understand that what might appear morbid to modern sensibilities was, in its historical context, an act of love and remembrance. The exhibition opening drew significant media attention, with coverage ranging from thoughtful historical pieces to more sensationalized headlines about creepy Victorian death photographs. Elizabeth had anticipated this range of responses and was prepared to address both the genuine historical interest and the tendency toward morbid fascination that post-mortem imagery could sometimes provoke. In interviews with journalists and historians, Elizabeth emphasized the human story behind the photograph. "This isn't about shock value or macabre curiosity," she explained to a reporter from the Washington Post. "This is about understanding how our ancestors dealt with loss, particularly the devastating loss of a child. The Harrison family's photograph is heartbreaking, yes, but it's also a testament to their love for Sarah and their desire to preserve her memory. They wanted future generations to know that Sarah existed, that she was loved, and that her brief life mattered." The exhibition attracted diverse visitors with varying reactions. Some found the content deeply moving, standing before the Harrison family portrait with tears in their eyes as they absorbed the story of a family's loss more than 140 years ago. Parents, in particular, often responded with intense emotion, imagining their own children in Sarah's place and understanding viscerally why the Harrison family had commissioned this photograph, despite the pain of creating it. Other visitors expressed discomfort or confusion about the practice of photographing the dead, particularly children. Elizabeth and the museum docents were prepared for these reactions and used them as opportunities for education, explaining how Victorian Americans had a very different relationship with death than most modern Americans do, living in an era when death occurred primarily at home and when most people would see deceased family members prepared for burial, rather than having death sanitized and hidden away in funeral homes and hospitals. School groups visited the exhibition as part of units on 19th century American history and public health. Teachers used the Harrison family photograph as a focal point for discussions about childhood mortality, advances in medicine, changing cultural attitudes toward death, and the importance of historical empathy, understanding that people in different times and places had different customs and values that made sense in their context. Several descendants of the Harrison family contacted Elizabeth after learning about the exhibition. Among them was David Harrison, a great-great-great-grandson of Robert and Catherine Harrison, living in California. David had known about Sarah's death. It was part of the family history passed down through generations, but he had never seen the memorial photograph. "Reading my ancestors' words about losing Sarah and seeing this photograph that meant so much to them has given me a profound connection to family members I never knew," David told Elizabeth during his visit to the exhibition. "I understand now why they held on to this image for so long, even though looking at it must have been painful. Sarah wasn't forgotten. She was remembered and loved." Elizabeth had arranged for the Harrison family portrait to be professionally digitized at the highest possible resolution, with the original photograph then carefully preserved in climate-controlled archival storage. The digital version was made available through the Smithsonian's online collections, accompanied by the full context of Sarah's story and the extensive research Elizabeth had conducted. The photograph quickly became one of the most viewed items in the museum's digital archives, generating discussions about Victorian culture, mourning practices, and childhood mortality across social media platforms and educational websites. Not all the online attention was thoughtful or respectful. Some users shared the image without context, treating it as merely creepy or disturbing content. Elizabeth worked with the Smithsonian's digital team to ensure that the photograph could not be easily separated from its historical context and educational information, though she acknowledged they couldn't control how people shared or discussed the image once it entered the public sphere. As the exhibition continued through the summer and fall of 2025, Elizabeth reflected on what the project had taught her about history, memory, and the power of photographs to connect us across time. The Harrison family portrait began as what appeared to be a simple family photograph, she told an audience at a symposium on Victorian material culture. For decades, even centuries, people who saw it probably didn't notice anything unusual. But once you know what you're looking at, once you see little Sarah's distant gaze and understand that this is a memorial portrait created days after her death from scarlet fever, the photograph transforms from a curious historical artifact into a deeply human story about love, loss, and remembrance. She continued, "Sarah Harrison lived only 6 years, but her family's decision to include her in this final family portrait ensured that she would be remembered more than 140 years later. We know her name, we know how she died, we know that her mother arranged her golden curls and dressed her in a white gown made for a wedding she would never attend. We know that her father stood behind her protectively, even in death, and that her brothers placed their hands on her chair in a final act of brotherly care. And we know that her loss devastated her family and motivated them to help other children through their charitable work. Elizabeth concluded her talk by addressing the tension between historical education and sensitivity to distressing content. There's always a question when presenting material like this. Is it appropriate? Is it respectful? Does it serve an educational purpose? Or is it merely exploiting tragedy? I believe strongly that the Harrison family photograph, presented with full context and with deep respect for Sarah and her family, serves an important educational purpose. It helps us understand not just Victorian mourning practices, but the universal human experience of loss and the ways people throughout history have sought to remember and honor those who died too soon. The photograph that had seemed so innocent for so long, just a Victorian family sitting for a formal portrait, had revealed its heartbreaking secret when historians finally noticed the little girl's distant gaze and understood what they were truly seeing. Sarah Harrison's memorial portrait had become a window into the past, teaching new generations about history, mortality, and the enduring power of love to transcend even death. In the years following the exhibition, the Harrison family photograph became a frequently cited example in studies of Victorian mourning culture and memorial photography. It appeared in textbooks, was featured in documentaries about 19th century American life, and inspired additional research into the experiences of families who lost children during the era of high childhood mortality. Sarah's story, preserved in that single photograph taken in September 1883, continued to touch hearts and educate minds more than 140 years after her brief life ended. The photograph remained in the Smithsonian's permanent collection, a testament to the Harrison family's love for their daughter, to the Victorian practice of memorial photography, and to the power of historical research to reveal stories hidden in plain sight for generations. And somewhere in that image, if you looked closely enough at little Sarah's peaceful face and distant gaze, you could almost imagine that she knew her family's act of love would ensure she would never truly be forgotten.